College football nerds here talking Oregon and Georgia. We're super excited. It's week one, obviously. I got Josh with me here getting nerdy, and we are here to talk with y'all about some fun college football. We've got a couple of previews that we've already done. We're doing a couple more this week, but we did also do a great series on NIL and transfers, and you probably didn't get a notification because YouTube algorithm goes a little sleepy on us in the off season since we take a break, but make sure you hit that notification bell if you didn't get it. And we'll post a link in the description, or you can check out our homepage on YouTube and see a lot of all season content that we've been doing the last month or so. All right, Josh, let's get into this game. And I want to, off the bat, talk about the two new faces at Oregon. There's obviously other new faces, but these are the ones that everybody wants to talk about. Dan Lanning and Bo Nix. And first, let's do Lanning. Josh, we've seen a lot of this. People are familiar with all of the Saban coaching tree and the former coaches that he's faced. In your opinion, just off the bat, how valuable is it that Kirby Smart's defensive coordinator is shipped off to Oregon and is facing him in game one? Is there any strategic advantage that might tip the scales to Oregon's favor, a little inside baseball that maybe a normal, really good coach at Oregon wouldn't have?
I definitely think there's something of an advantage. We saw that the first year Lane Kiffin was at Ole Miss. He nearly beat an Alabama squad in 2020 that no one else really could touch. And I don't think it's a total coincidence. It does help when you have a coordinator that was at a school for a while, because Lanning is going to know what bothers the Georgia offense. He's been scrimmaging against those guys week after week after week, and he kind of knows the tendencies of the players. He knows where the scheme maybe has issues. And when you put that all together, yeah, he's going to have some plays where, maybe he knows Stetson Bennett in this formation likes to roll this way, and he really has trouble if you bring this kind of blitz. It is a little bit of an advantage. Now, I don't think it's a huge advantage, and in large part, it's because Lanning is a defensive coordinator. The reason I say that is that the offense dictates the game in college football. The offense is going to dictate the defensive formation. The offensive play dictates the way coverage works. And so you really have to be reactionary, and so maybe you have a couple trap coverages or something like that. But that's about all there is to it. For an offensive coach, if you're more familiar, then you can do things where you can put the opposing defense in a situation where they're really uncomfortable, because you get to dictate the formations, the pace, everything like that. And I think Lanning maybe has some insight being the defensive coordinator from Georgia, but I doubt that he's necessarily been sitting there thinking about what he can do to exploit Georgia's defense. And again, there's a difference when he's sitting there scrimmaging as the defensive coordinator for Georgia versus somebody else that's a, offensive coordinator maybe that had been scrimmaging, and then he's sitting there day after day in practice and in scrimmages trying to figure out how to poke holes in the offense or the defense that he's formerly played. So I do think it's an advantage. I don't think it's a really significant one. Maybe it gives you 5 impact plays over the course of the game. But I say impact plays, 5 opportunities to really do something with a bit of knowledge you have. But that's going to be about it.
So also with Bo Nix, and I think that Georgia fans feel like they're familiar with Bo Nix, kind of a sandlot sort of guy, had to make things happen at Auburn, and wasn't super impressive in his opportunities against Georgia. But I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like at Oregon there might be a little bit more opportunity for Bo Nix to do the things that Bo Nix is good at, because to me, I wonder in the back of my mind how much of him having to be the sandlot guy that we learned him to be was because the offensive scheme wasn't tailored to what he was good at. It was really kind of disjointed, in my opinion, at Auburn the whole time. How much do you have in maybe your thought process with breaking down this game that there is this opportunity to see a Bo Nix that's a lot better because he's a lot more comfortable in this Dillingham offense than maybe he was at Auburn?
Well, Bo Nix is going to be Bo Nix, which means at any given moment it's going to be a mystery where the ball is going or if it's going to leave his hand. But I do expect that he's going to be more comfortable in the system that Oregon presented. I watched the Oregon spring game. It was kind of fun. You watch the ball go this way, you watch the ball that way. It's like, wee, back and forth the whole time. But I never really felt like there's a lot of consistency to it. I felt like Bo Nix was more comfortable because he was pulling the trigger a lot faster. He seemed to find the open guy quickly, but there were a lot of really open guys in that spring game, just sort of due to the way they mixed rosters, and due to the holes that I think really that they had defensively in both units. But I think the biggest thing last year with Bo Nix at Auburn was that Auburn kind of learned about halfway through the season that at his core, he is kind of a sandlot player and he's comfortable playing that way. Harsin tried to make him be more of a traditional quarterback. It didn't work very well. And it really wasn't until really that near loss to a really inferior opponent in the middle of the season when TJ Finley came in that they kind of gave up on that. And I felt like it was the Ole Miss game in particular where they said, all right, screw it, Bo, just go be Bo. I think Oregon's probably going to be a little less rigid in that regard. I think, frankly, that was a failure of the prior coaching staff at Auburn, and I think really the way he had been used previously at Auburn was a failure in a lot of other levels. I think if you let him be a deep shot, take some risks guy, and you just kind of give him carte blanche to do that, I think you're going to find a much more effective quarterback. So I do think he's going to be maybe more comfortable. I think the problem when you have that whole discussion is, yeah, again, it was easy for him to be that way when he was playing Oregon in the spring game. It's going to be a very different animal for them when they're having to face against a live Georgia defense in Atlanta.
Georgia State was that inferior opponent you were thinking of, and Auburn trailed that game with, I think, less than 1 minute to go, and TJ Finley pulled one out on fourth down. Yeah, and that's really where I want to direct this conversation now. Georgia fans have been patiently waiting for us to talk about their team. And by the way, Georgia fans, we did a team preview for Georgia this year. You can check that out if you didn't get that notification. I feel like sort of based on the commentary from the spring game and based on what we think we might get from Bo Nix in this Oregon offense, they're probably going to find some points. They're probably going to find some points that maybe, a more traditional attack, even something from like an Alabama, may not be that good against this Georgia defense. They might find some explosion points, but Josh, if we don't see a better Oregon on both lines, is it going to matter? Because they might find 17 explosive points, but also might give up 50?
I think there's a pretty serious conversation to be had there. When you talk about Oregon's season last year, they definitely were a team that started off strong against Ohio State, faded a little bit late, and the correlation there had a lot to do with their ability to play defense. I mean, late in the year, Utah had about 4.2 yards per carry the first time, 4.8 yards per carry the second time. Oklahoma blew their doors off, 7.5 yards a carry and 43 carries, over 300 yards rushing. I felt like when Oregon played more physical defensive or offensive lines in particular, they really struggled. And then, offensively, I think that's really where the biggest issues came in. Because against Utah, both games, they were held under 3 yards a carry. Their season highs, I always felt like this is sort of an interesting observation about where something maybe was a little weird and shouldn't be taken away. It was first Colorado, 7.1 yard per carry. Also was Ohio State, and it was 7.08 yards per carry in that game. I think if you take away what Oregon was as a rushing attack based on that Ohio State game, and I'm saying this if you're a fan of either team, it just can't be realistic. I mean, if Ohio State is not a significantly worse rush defense than Fresno State or, Arizona or UCLA. They're just not. And I think they played exceptionally poorly, and I think Oregon really kind of caught them napping. I think the reality is that Oregon's rushing attack isn't necessarily ideal. And this is a good point, too, to bring up, the key loss for them, which was Kayvon Thibodeau, and he was an impact guy that affected every play. So now the question, too, is you take a team that did struggle at times on their front, you take away a player that a lot of people felt like was, maybe one of the most dominant front players in college football. And yeah, he was in and out of the lineup for various reasons, as he kind of was his whole career. Still not, I think there's a lot of Jadeveon Clowney there that I'm not sure that his actual contribution to the team was ever quite what the potential should have been. But he was still a very good player. And so now you get to face a Georgia team that is I mean, Georgia's just dominant offensively last year, and maybe I think it's worth taking a break because I'm not sure Oregon fans necessarily appreciate that to talk about how good Georgia actually is offensively, and maybe to an extent that a lot of people don't appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Oregon fans would love for you to take a break out of talking about how Georgia's going to score points to explain exactly why Georgia's offense is good enough to put up crazy points. Because you're right, and this is something I do want you to get into because we spent a lot of time talking about offensive efficiency from Georgia last year, and we also talked about a lot of people don't understand because of the joke of the 5 tight end sets or whatever. People don't understand, one, that Georgia was so dominant last year in a way that we've seen Alabama in the past and Ohio State through their schedules, that Georgia didn't score as many points as they absolutely could have. And that's why you look at those efficiency numbers. And even still on points per game, they were still really up there. So, yeah, get into that a little bit because, when everybody – this kind of frustrates me about how and why I think Georgia sometimes gets forgotten about a little bit. Everybody thinks about how good that defense is. And in the modern day of college football, people will say, well, you got to have offense. You got to be able to score 50. Well, wait, Georgia can do that. So explain that a little bit.
In terms of offensive points per drive, that's just points scored per times you get the football. Georgia was 4th in the country last year. You know where Alabama was? They were 6th. Georgia averaged 3.4 points per drive. In other words, every time Georgia got the ball, they averaged more than a field goal every possession. The only teams that actually did better than them were Ohio State was number 1. They were at 3.9 points, so about 0.6 of a point ahead. Coastal Carolina and Western Kentucky, so 2 G5 teams playing a completely different type of football because you play completely different type of defense. So Georgia, I think, gets kind of a bad rap because people didn't see as high a point total, and it was purely because Georgia was much more run-based. They played at a much slower tempo, and as a result, they played fewer possessions. Scoring less points because you play fewer possessions does not make you a worse offense. It's just a different style of football. Now, I might argue that playing fewer possessions actually fights against you as a team that is more talented than your opponent because the fewer possessions you are, the more variability comes into play, right? Like if you want to be 500 or better flipping tails, the more times you flip a coin, the closer you're going to get to 500. In the same way that Georgia's shortening possessions actually kind of helps sometimes the underdog opponents. But regardless, when you're 4th in the country in points scored per drive, and in terms of FEI offense, they were 3rd in the country in offensive FEI. Those are really, really good numbers. And, I think you've got to give credit to the fact that Oregon, you talk about offensive efficiency. Oregon was 9th in offensive FEI last year. This is not by any means a bad team. I think offensively they could be better. I think this game could be a little higher scoring than some people expect. I think maybe there's Georgia fans thinking they're going to shut Oregon out. Don't know that that's realistic. I think there's probably Oregon fans thinking, this is kind of a plotting Georgia team. We're going to hold them to 20, no problem. Probably equally unrealistic. And I'll run through the roster really quickly for both teams. On the Georgia side, you've got, everybody knows Stetson Bennett. People generally know they've got great tight ends, and they've really got 3 of them. I think Gilbert is the most explosive. I don't mean best. I mean explosive player because of his ability to separate downfield on a safety. The best of the 3 is Brock Bowers. Bowers has just kind of been a Gronk level all-around great tight end. No one's really had an answer for him. I'm outside the UAB game, though. I'm not sure that he's necessarily a threat to have a lot of 40-plus yard receiving plays. The bigger deal with him is that he's a constant threat. Again, efficiency, move the chains. And then they have Darnell Washington, who was really injured, didn't even play the beginning of the year, really injured all year. So you've got 3 big targets. That complements a receiving core that I'm reasonably happy with. I don't think they're fantastic. McConkey is someone that's going to take advantage of opportunities. He has really good speed. Same thing with Adonai Mitchell, who came in last year. Kyaris Jackson's the guy that's been around for a long time. More of your running back build slot type. What they don't really have are a lot of downfield speed demons. Those, tall targets. Dominic Blaylock probably should fit that mold. I don't think he's back from injury. Arian Smith got hurt, was a speed demon, and then, Rosemy Jacksaint got hurt against Florida, and I don't know that he's quite been the same since. Though there's still the opportunity there. But you combine that with a great running game, got a great offense for Georgia. I'll let you get in 2 words there because it's been a bit of a monologue. But after that, we can maybe talk a little bit more about Oregon.
Yeah, and to your point about the receivers, because Georgia fans bristle at that, and I think that we've been completely fair on the wide receiver front. Like, look, if receivers are injured all year, like, we're not going to count them in your depth or quality because they don't play. But talking about receivers from last year, Jermaine Burton he was the number 1 wide receiver in terms of yards. I'm not talking about receiving because that was Brock Bowers. He had the most receiving yards on the team. But for the wide receiver unit, Jermaine Burton was number 1. He's starting X position wide receiver at Alabama this year. Ladd McConkey was number 2. And Georgia fans, where we were all in on Stetson Bennett by really early in the season, and Georgia fans called us crazy, they were calling us crazy too because we weren't all in on Ladd McConkey being an SEC caliber wide receiver 1, and he's not. 447 yards last year, total yards receiving. And then Mitchell was right behind him. So I'm not super stoked about this wide receiver room. I don't think if a Georgia fan is really looking at it fairly would say that they're amazing either. But the greater than the sum of their parts thing is what happens in this offense, and it is an efficiency monster. You want to talk about Oregon, and here's a point that I think that maybe not a lot of people are touching on, and I think is a fair one, and I want you to get into it a little bit. We try to chase numbers on this channel. We try to chase scheme and matchups, things that are a little more technical, excuse me, and not a lot of gut feeling kind of things. But if you so Oregon stubbed their toe in Stanford last year, or at Stanford, had an overtime loss. Other than that game, they're rolling into Utah undefeated, right? They get blown out, Utah. 2 weeks later, get blown out again. But at that same time, at the end of the year, they had a coach that was shopping. There was a coach that had maybe 1 foot out the door. And our kind of lasting impression of who Oregon is last year isn't the team that rolled into the shoe and handled their business and really was more physical and ran it down their throat. Our lasting impression of Oregon last year was a team that got blown out by Utah and blown out by Oklahoma. Is it fair, Josh, to say that now, kind of like Florida in that decent roster, bad culture, maybe at the end of the season, is it fair that we should maybe think about, when we're talking about the Oregon that's going to face Georgia, more about the one that reeled off a bunch of wins in a row heading into that Utah game and less about the one that was finishing the season with a coach with 1 foot out the door?
I think that might be fair. There were a lot of things that went against Oregon. They had injury issues, like if you want to talk pure talent, right? I mean, Oregon defensively, they had Thibodeau, but they've also got guys with Sewell and Flo that Georgia absolutely recruited. I mean, they've got stud linebackers, and they lost Flo the beginning of the year. And I feel like by the end of the season, they just seemed kind of banged up. They had a coach that I don't know if his foot was out the door or not, but didn't really seem to be able to get the same level of physicality out of the football team, didn't seem to get the same level of enthusiasm. And I think it's been a little bit of a hallmark, frankly, for Cristobal teams to be very up and down. Right after they beat Ohio State, I say right after, but a few weeks later, they lose to a not particularly good Stanford team in overtime. And those two things shouldn't happen to the same team in the same year. And I think Utah punched them in the mouth a little bit on both occasions, and both times they didn't really rise to that occasion. So I do think having a coach that maybe is a little more hard-nosed, a little more energetic, and maybe a little more likely to get consistency out of his team could be a very positive thing. And turning it to talk a little bit more positively about Oregon's roster, I mean, there's reasons to be positive. They had a young receiving core last year. Travis Dye is gone. He's now, transfer portal hitting everybody. He's now the running back at USC. Both these teams losing starters on offense. But, otherwise, you get back Chris Hudson. You get back Troy Franklin that came on late in the year. I think Seven McGee has a chance to be a really powerful player for them that can do a lot of different things. They've got a lot of speed. They've got a lot of talent at the skill positions and in the back seven. I don't think they're going to be shocked by Georgia from that perspective. It's really, and that's why we kind of talk about physicality so much. I think it really is a question of how well they hold up in the trenches. And so that's a two-part thing, right? The first part is mental, and the second part is physical. And look, almost everybody in the country, if not everyone in the country, is going to be at a disadvantage physically against Georgia in the trenches. Certainly on the offensive line, Georgia has an excellent group. They're going to push around just about everybody. The most top-tier defenses nationally, we talk about this every season, can slow or stop a great rushing attack. Georgia's not going to be immune to that like no one is. Defensively, they've got a lot of great pieces coming back. There's a lot of turnover. We're not quite sure. Maybe Oregon's got a shot. I mean, they've got a good offensive line. They've got a ton of all those guys coming back on that offensive line. So, you put all that together, and I think there's a really good shot for this Oregon roster to look a lot more cohesive than it did last year, or to look, especially the offensive side of the ball, to maybe have a blend of physicality and speed that they didn't quite have last season. I think the main concern, at least in my mind, is a defense that did have a fair amount of turnover. Yeah, they've got guys coming back from injury. They've got Gonzalez transferring in at corner. There's reasons to be optimistic, but I'm just not entirely sold that they're going to be able to handle the efficiency train that Georgia's going to run full steam ahead straight at them.
All right, so that gets us into pick time, and first I want to credit both of these teams for playing this game. Georgia doesn't get enough credit for their out-of-conference scheduling because they play Georgia Tech every year. And I know people say, blah, Georgia Tech, but that's a Power 5 out-of-conference game. So they could just mark it off their list and say, we got ours, we're done. They still play a tough team. I mean, they opened with Clemson last year. They had a home-and-home with Notre Dame when, Notre Dame was really, really good. I think that people aren't giving Georgia enough credit for this. But also on the flip side, Oregon has scheduled these quote-unquote neutral site games with SEC teams. I think either the Washington or the Oregon game, y'all help me out in the comments, was in Atlanta versus Auburn. Washington or Oregon versus Auburn was in Atlanta. This one's in Atlanta. These aren't neutral site games. They're traveling and not getting the home return, and I think it's awesome that they're willing to do that. Oregon's also got BYU on the schedule. That's like it's not a P5, it's a P5 light, but they still got them. And instead of scheduling a New Mexico State, they're scheduling a game against BYU. This is awesome for college football. Both of these teams deserve credit, and I'm not punishing Oregon if they lose this game, especially if they lose it close. If they run the table. Like, if we're talking about the fourth best team in a playoff field, if Georgia's number one and Oregon loses this game in Atlanta by 3 touchdowns, that doesn't mean that they can't be in the playoffs. I'm sorry. We saw what LSU did to Oklahoma in 2019. So with that, I think this is going to be a pretty decent spread. 17.5 is a tough number for me because it is right where I want to pick it. I think that... And we haven't talked about this, Josh, and I'm going to have you talk about it in your discussion. I'm going to go just under that. Give me 36-20 Georgia. And one of the things that I want you to talk about that we didn't touch on, and I'd have regret if we didn't, talk about it in the context of your pick, is week 1, Georgia replacing a lot of pieces for what made them great. Last year, week 1, those pieces may not be nearly as good as they are in week 10 or 11, or nearly as ready, which might give Oregon some opportunities to steal some points. Does that factor at all into your approach when you're picking a score for this game? And do you think it's going to factor in this game on Saturday?
So my prediction for this game, I'm throwing something out there, is 37-24. I'm right with you. I think the over-under is at 53. The line's about 17. So the Vegas is saying this is effectively about a 34-17 game. I think that line's really kind of dead on. I have a hard time. We say this a lot, picking games like this, because the majority of the time we find the spread, when we run a computer model, which we'll run after 4 weeks, we only use in-season data, so we don't run it early in the year. We usually find the Vegas lines within about 3 points in the model. I think we would find it here. I think Vegas is setting it as accurately as you can. And whether or not they cover or not cover is honestly going to be a bit of a coin flip, depending on the way the game goes. The reason that I'm picking Georgia not to cover isn't that I don't think they'll have a lead. It's that I think the reality of having a lot of new pieces on defense in a game where you're in week one probably will cause Oregon to be able to cover despite being that competitive on the scoreboard around the third quarter. I think the way this is going to go, if I had to bet, is that Oregon is going to score some points early. They're going to have some scripted drives. Lanning's going to find a way to get some points on the board. But they're going to be very inconsistent offensively. That's a hallmark of Bo Nix. And I think it's a hallmark of any team built the way they are, where they're really based on speed at receiver and at running back. I think it's kind of fun to watch Oregon in this mode. I mean, I miss those old days. But I still have nightmares of that LSU-Oregon game from 2011 where you saw those guys get kind of thrown around a little bit. I don't think you're going to see that result. I think they've learned to be more physical over the years. But just like that game where they kind of were in it early and then it really got away from them, I think you're going to see something similar here. The difference is that Georgia's a lot more plotting, and I think they're going to just slowly build a lead. And I think by the third quarter, I'm seeing this being something like 34-13 in the third quarter. And when they get into the fourth, and it's, if it's 34-13 midway through the fourth quarter, I don't know that Georgia's going to have the same intensity. And at some point, they may even put their backups in the last drive. I'm really kind of seeing this being like a 34-17 game where Oregon puts up points with their starters against Georgia's second string with, 90 seconds left in the ball game, that kind of thing. I think it's just going to be hard to keep them off the board with that much. I think it's honestly going to be hard for both teams to keep the other off the board. But you never know. And Georgia does have a very good defense, and maybe they step up. But just thinking back to a couple years ago, if you're a Georgia fan, it's difficult to shut people down when you have a lot of new pieces defensively. Week one against a team with this much explosive speed, they're going to get a couple touchdowns, I think, but not enough to really make it that competitive.
All right, y'all, that's it for us on Georgia and Oregon. Again, if you didn't get any of notifications from us this off season and you want to check out the Georgia preview or our NIL series or some of the other previews that we've done, make sure and check out our home YouTube page. Check the links in the description and hit that notification bell. And if you haven't subscribed already, that'd be huge for us. Please hit that subscribe. But also your homework for this one, give us your score prediction in the comments below, and that's how we'll know that you made it to the end of the video. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week and enjoy the opening week of college football. God bless.